Okay, so I think we can get started. Good afternoon to speakers and participants, and welcome everyone to this GOVTRAN webinar on the subject of hydrocarbon exporters and the EU decarbonization plans. What coping strategies? The external dimension of the energy transition is the subject of growing attention for scholars and policy circles. The main question is to what extent the geographical and technical features of clean energy systems may affect political, economic, and ideational patterns of interstate relations. But of course, a large part of this discussion focuses on the impact that reduced demand for oil and gas in large markets could have among producing countries. This question is particularly relevant for Europe, which on the basis of its commitment to climate neutrality should see a reduction of fossil fuel imports from 900 to about 200 million tons of oil equivalent in the next 30 years. And is surrounded by many countries that are dependent on the export of fossil fuels and particularly dependent on Europe as an export outlet. So with this discussion, we want to understand what kind of repercussions are to be expected within these countries and in their bilateral relations with Europe, and how suppliers are interpreting and preparing for such a structural change, and whether we are heading towards a mutual disengagement or a redesign of bilateral external relations. So to make things more practical and concrete, we selected the three cases in particular, the Middle East and North African region, Norway and Russia, with the objective to bringing, besides oil, the issue of natural gas as well, which is particularly interesting due to its regional geopolitical sensitivity and the fact that the narratives are shifting with respect to the role of this commodity in the process of decarbonization. So the discussion we are going to hold is openly accessible and recorded and will be structured as follows. We will first hear from several regional and country experts about the predicament of the countries and regions we are going to examine. Then we are expecting a representative of the European Commission to also join us and introduce some reflection on the external dimension of the European Green Deal. And we will open the floor to a question and answer session with the audience. Please notice that the participants will not be seen or heard. It will be possible to type the question in the Q&A box, and we will direct the question to the speakers. So without further ado, I will start with Mr. Mostafa Uki, who is a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute.
I am connected now.
Yes.
Can I? I'm sorry, but I managed to connect. I'm Tudor Constantinescu.
Okay, so. Okay, thanks a lot. So we will go for the original program, letting Mr. Tudor Constantinescu, principal advisor at the DG Energy of the European Commission, to introduce some reflection about the external dimension of the European Green Deal, and then we'll go case by case before the Q&A section. So, Mr. Constantinescu, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the problems with the connection, but it's sometimes like this. I'm very pleased anyhow to be with you here today. Thank you for the invitation. I'm pleased to represent DGNR in this meeting and to share with you some thoughts about the external dimension of the Green Deal and also the energy transition. You know that the post-COVID economic recovery and the transition to sustainable, socially just and resilient and climate neutral economy go actually hand in hand in our view. and key energy transition is absolutely fundamental in this regard. Europe is leading in this respect and is committed to engage with all the resources. We will be spending 1.8 trillion euros to reboot the economy after the COVID crisis. And the Council agreed that 30% of the next generation EU package and of the multi-annual funds will have to go to climate-related expenditures. And therefore, the Green Deal will give really further strength to the Paris Agreement and will help achieving the 55% greenhouse gas emission target reduction by 2030. And this is very important because having this more ambitious target for 2030, this will actually put us on a very sustainable pathway for the so much needed investment in the energy sector. So we'll have maybe more capex in the beginning, but will lower the overall operational system cost in longer term. And from this perspective, the objectives and the philosophy of the Green Deal will very much actually help economic recovery in following the COVID crisis. I hope you can still hear me.
Yes, we hear you.
So in this respect, and to implement the Green Deal, we came with a number of strategies. The offshore renewable strategy, which is to tap the potential of renewables offshore. The renovation wave strategy, because energy efficiency remains, as we say, a top priority, and this may be energy efficiency first concept. And we see here with the renovation wave aiming to double or even triple the current rate of renovation. We have actions on the decarbonization of transport, also support research and innovation, and many of these have the link to the concept of energy system integration, a communication which we issued last year in July, at the same time with a hydrogen strategy, and at the same time with the Clean Hydrogen Alliance, actually bringing all the stakeholders, all the actors together in this respect. In the context of the Green Deal, we aim to achieve in long term the climate neutral objective established and defined by our President von der Leyen for 2050, and which was very much accepted and also supported by all member states. So it's recognized the climate emergency, and therefore we need to act. But we also know that we cannot act alone, of course, because Europe at the end accounts for only 8% of the global emissions. However, the role of energy policy in a 2050 perspective is clear. And it's important to acknowledge that by 2050, we estimate to have an increased share of electricity, and of course within this electricity mainly renewables, but a part of this, about 50% electrons which will consume, half of the final energy consumption may be in the form of molecules. And here we speak very much also, of course, about biomethane and biofuels, but the large part will have to come from hydrogen and from derived fuels, synthetic fuels based on particularly renewable hydrogen. And this is all linked into one of the important dimensions of the energy system integration, which I was referring to. So again, we are responsible for 8% of the emissions. So more countries will have to act. And what we see is that meanwhile, also Japan has established an objective to become carbon neutral by 2050. Also, China has established an objective to become carbon neutral by 2060. So it is really a global movement gradually, and everywhere citizens and politicians understand this climate emergency and also the need to act faster in this respect. So also we expect strengthened collaboration in this respect with the United States, who now have rejoined the Paris Agreement, and with a much more commitment on the climate and energy transition aspects following the recent elections. Now, we cooperate, of course, also with the other regions of the world and the other countries. Let me just mention the cooperation with our neighbors in East and South, and how important it is to achieve, for example, the hydrogen objective, and there's a potential identified to have the potential identified by industry for extra 40 gigawatts renewable hydrogen production, in addition to the 40 gigawatts identified and promoted under the strategy, under the EU strategy at EU level. We look forward to strengthen our relation with all the Mediterranean region and to establish stabilization and growth pacts. And in this respect, we are going to support and to work towards the next Union for the Mediterranean Ministerial Conference on Energy, even this April in Portugal during the Portuguese presidency. So we have a perfect opportunity to enhance here our perspective for cooperation, and also to strengthen our cooperation in general with Africa in respect of the green energy initiative, to increase the share of renewables, to support, on the other hand, also the energy access and energy efficiency for the entire region. Buildings are also important. And in this respect, the Commission has published a communication on a renewed partnership with the Southern Neighbourhood just recently in February. And this partnership is speaking about reinforced bilateral engagement in making the energy transition, and also making hydrogen production for domestic consumption, but also for export. So these are important elements which I wanted to mention. I would like also to mention, of course, that the transition will doesn't mean that things can be changed overnight. That's why it's a transition. We work, on the other hand, to try to secure that this almost half of the final energy consumption will be also decarbonized, not only the electrons, but also the molecules. That's why we work on the decarbonization of the gas market, and we have a major initiative for this year also on gas. So first of all, we'll have on energy efficiency and renewables, which will have to go into the direction of the 55 greenhouse gas emission reduction target. But in addition to that, we will have also on gas decarbonization, and this is very important, as in medium and long term we need to find renewable and low carbon alternatives to replace a good part of the natural gas. Addressing methane emissions will continue also to be very important, and all this we'll try to do based on this integrated approach. So another aspect is in relation, because I guess this is of interest today. Of course, we acknowledge the important role of natural gas in the energy transition, but for like other fossil fuels, towards 2050, of course, the share will decrease, but we expect that biogas, biomethane, hydrogen, e-gases, some produced in Europe, some imported, will actually replace gradually important shares of natural gas, and towards 2050 make sure that we get to the carbon neutrality objective which we collectively have assumed. For this, we need also to modernize the infrastructure. So, and this infrastructure refers, of course, to the infrastructure we have in terms of pipelines. So, for instance, renewable and low carbon hydrogen can be transported by repurposing existing gas infrastructure, but also building new pipelines, injecting hydrogen into existing natural gas networks, or producing synthetic methane. All these options will have to be considered in planning at transport level, distribution level. With increasing demand, the need for infrastructure connecting demand with favorable production locations will also increase. And such connections are important for renewable hydrogen, because some favorable location for renewable hydrogen may not be in Europe. So we need also the ports, we need the terminals to be gradually adapted to be able to handle this growing share of other forms of renewable energy being imported to Europe. So my final point will be then about the fact that we need to work together with all the partners, with all the actors, to make this clean energy transition and also Paris Agreement objective achievable and successful. So, because clean and safe energy at the end is a global issue, and we have to cooperate internationally with all. The Green Deal transition will transform Europe and global economic and trade relationships, this is clear, but we need to build a climate neutral economy powered by renewables and low carbon energy sources, and Europe is determined to play an important role in this, because it's also paying an important part of the global energy bill, and because climate neutrality cannot be achieved alone. So we'll continue to be at the center of this, and we'll continue to work with everyone. We see a role for natural gas in short and medium term, but in long run, of course, we need, as I mentioned before, we need to move towards decarbonized gases and renewable gases as well as a priority. And this technology change should come with more innovation, with more investment in innovation, but also we'll need to work in a multilateral, not only bilateral, but also in multilateral for us together. And here I would like to mention the Mission Innovation, the Clean Energy Ministerial, but of course the big for us of the G20 as well, where we'll try to work with all the partners towards this cleaner energy transition. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Tudor Constantinescu. Unfortunately, we could hear you, but we could not see you properly. So perhaps what I could suggest, if you could switch off and on the camera again for the remainder of the discussion. But
I'm just to say that I had the camera open all the time, but I cannot see. I see a black screen also myself, so I don't see.
Okay. So without further ado, I would then move to the other speakers. So Mr. Mostafa Uki is a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and he will speak about, against this context, what he could see as the main opportunities and risk for this region. So Mr. Uki, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you for the invitation. The Middle East, if you look at the Middle East and North Africa, also known as the MENA region, everybody knows that it's not a homogeneous region or a group of countries. And there are differences, some fundamental differences between different parts of the MENA region. And because of that, countries or group of countries will be affected in different way by the decarbonization plan and the way they will have to cope with this decarbonization or climate change plans. If you look at, we were talking about exports and exports to Europe, if you look at the level of what I would call export dependency that this group of country has, you will notice that you have basically two subgroups. You have a group where North Africa, where Europe accounts for 80% or over 80% of all the exports from North Africa going to Europe, while the rest, the Middle East, mainly the Gulf area, where you have Europe accounting for just only 20% of all their exports, and it's mainly Qatar. But it remains an important market for the Middle East. And that means that, you know, they will react, they will prepare and react differently. Then there is the way they will prepare, or how they have been working on this decarbonization or introduction of clean energy. If you look at the GCC, the Gulf Council country area of the Middle East, you will see that if you compare them to the North African hydrocarbon exporter, they're relatively better prepared than North African exporters. And I explain, it could be, one could argue it's because of the financial resources that they have, but if you look at what has been happening over the last maybe 5 or even 5 years, we notice that countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and to a certain extent Oman and Qatar, they have been working on the introduction of clean energy program, especially focused on renewable energy. I know the skeptics among us would say that's not enough, but it's a good start. And this is enshrined in their energy policies, whether it came in the form of an economic, a macro, or a global vision for the countries, or roadmaps, or energy policies. So we see that there is some kind of difference between these two groups of countries. However, when you look at, answering the question which is posed by the theme of this conference, how are they preparing, how are they coping? I think all of them face the same question or challenge. First of all, there is no clarity about the kind of decarbonization or climate change measures that will apply to these hydrocarbon exporters and when, and there is no clarity on the timeline. Now, I know we have been hearing a lot about the carbon-based adjustment mechanism or simply carbon taxes, but it's not clear when these are going to be applied and whether hydrocarbon exports will be considered initially as part of this plan, or is it going to be only energy-intensive manufactured product like steel and cement? So that's the first, kind of question that needs to be answered to understand how these countries are going to react to this kind of situation. Another thing, although I have to be clear on this thing, all the EU documents that have been issued with regard to decarbonization plans or anything which is related to Green Deal, it's very clear that the spirit of collaboration, cooperation is emphasized. The other thing which is clearly indicated also that all the measures will be compatible with WTO and with Europe's or the EU's international trade commitment. But if these measures, whatever they are, and hopefully we'll know more in June, if these measures are perceived or considered as sanctions, it could be counterproductive. And I explain. Again, there have been a lot of clarification on the part of the EU about what these measures will be in the framework. But if they're considered as sanctions or some kind of stick, that will kind of lead to some kind of legal challenges. And these legal challenges could come in the form of, on the basis of the Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, the WTO principle of the MFN principle against discrimination. Again, these are scenarios that could happen if, again, and I emphasize, if they're considered as sanction. And we don't need that. The last thing we need at the moment is this kind of legal situation that will delay the process and put us in a situation where we'll waste time. So it's very important that the point that I would like to emphasize, I'll come back on other points probably during the Q&A session. What is important is try to foster cooperation and collaboration. As Tudor was mentioning, it involves everybody. Climate change is a planetary situation, and I'm preaching to the choir when I say that. So it has to be done in a collaborative framework. And the other thing, which is very important also, and I think maybe I'll finish, is the fact that this whole decarbonization debate and measures and future legislation or regulation that will be put in place, in a way, it's helping the other side of the table, i.e. the hydrocarbon exporters. I see a positive aspect in the way that will help policymakers in some, what I would call some vulnerable oil and gas exporting countries to focus more on the question of energy transition. I know energy transition is a long process and not an easy one, but at least it will focus their mind on doing something. And this is very important. So I see a win-win situation if we have an equitable framework of collaboration to implement these measures, whatever these measures are going to be. And I'll stop here. As I said, I'll be happy to answer question later. Thank you.
Thank you very much for also bringing in some interesting questions to the debate that we hope we will be able to debate also interactively among the panelists as well. So I would now ask Olga Khrushcheva, a senior lecturer at the Manchester Metropolitan University, to help us understanding the predicament of Russia in the context of the European Green Deal. So Olga, you have the floor.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think there would be some overlap in the points I will be making with the previous speaker, because Russia, together with Norway, together with MENA region, all are external exporters, and all will be going through different but similar processes. In case of Russia specifically, I would like to open with a quote from my colleague Igor Makarov from Higher School of Economics, who said that for the EU, the green agenda and decarbonization is seen as an opportunity, and for Russia, at least in relation with the European Union, it is seen as a threat. And in my talk, I will kind of expand on this and talk about the opportunities which lie ahead for Russia there. So there are two important points, I think, here is, first of all, Russia and the European Union are on the different stages of energy transition and decarbonization. There are very different set of priorities, and Russia's own strategies on decarbonization and climate change are very modest, to say the least, and there are serious issues with how ambitious the Russian climate targets are, the technological issues in terms of transition to low carbon economy, need to further develop legislation and so on, and also the strategic importance of fossil fuels for Russian economy. So the export dependency. So in particular, for example, in the natural gas sector, 68% of the Russian gas exports are going to the European Union, and there is not much room in terms of diversification outside of this market because of the pricing policy and because of the fact that other major markets are also talking about carbon neutrality. As was mentioned earlier, China, for example, also announced the plans to become carbon neutral by 2060. So for Russia, of course, it's important to try and maintain the share of the European energy market as much as possible. And another important factor there for Russia and EU-Russia energy relations is how the relations were managed for a long time, namely the long-term contracts which dominated the gas trade. And in terms of the natural gas, 90% of Russian long-term contracts are due to expire by 2030, so there is not much time left there, and the European Union, through its ongoing process of establishing the single market for energy and liberalization of the single market, that you kind of like this nature of relationship are changing. So there is this sense, I guess, that the relationship are changing, the nature of the energy sector is changing, and the drive for the change is coming from the European Union, and Russia is in position currently where it needs to adjust quickly and sort of evolve if it wants to maintain its place in the European energy trade. So what would be the impact of a Green Deal and ongoing process of decarbonization in the European Union on Russia. So again, there are a couple of points there. So first of all, there is a very real possibility of a continuous gradual decrease of energy export to Europe because of measures the EU is planning to take on reducing dependency on fossil fuels by increasing the share of renewable energy and improving energy efficiency. So such as renovation wave and work on reducing the energy consumption by the residential sector and kind of heating and cooling of buildings. I think that it was mentioned that up to 40% of energy consumption comes from the heating and cooling of buildings. So reduction of the consumption there, improving energy efficiency, would lead to reducing demand as well as developments in other sectors, such as transport, including heavy transport, and ongoing work on improving energy efficiency in the industry. So this will gradually and continuously have an impact on the demand of the fossil fuels, and this is of course an area of concern for Russia. And second important point, which was again already mentioned today, is the question of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which again, as was said, there are still questions about the exact way it would be introduced and what exact impact it would have, and how it will look like for different industries, export-oriented industries in Russia. But this is taken seriously, and a lot of export-oriented companies in Russia are running risk assessments and thinking of the impact it may have, any form of carbon tax would have on them. And there are some preliminary estimates, financial estimates of these measures, which were evaluated in Russia, and they vary between 3 to 6 billion euros per year that the carbon border adjustment mechanism may mean for Russian export-oriented companies. So again, all of this creates such as like a pressure on Russia to adjust, and for a long time, sure, since the third energy package, there was a slightly different response from the businesses in Russia and from the authorities. And businesses, I think, were following it with kind of a growing, increasing interest and engagement and thinking what impact it would be on them, and the authorities were a bit more resistant to take it seriously and to accelerate the development of Russia's own policies in areas of decarbonization and low carbon economy. So Russia is now in the position of catching up in a way. There are still some opportunities. So as was mentioned today, natural gas will remain an important fuel source. It would still be used. It's not something you can very quickly stop using. It's a long-term process, long-term goals. And another one is increasing the share of alternative fuels in the energy mix, including hydrogen. And Russia there sees some potential for itself, and I think the European Union also sees Russia as a potential supplier of hydrogen. Russia can produce and already produces hydrogen in large quantities. Some of the hydrogen which is produced at the moment is used mainly in the existing gas sector, so it's sort of already used on the oil and gas facilities, rather than its produce in large quantities for export, but there is potential there, and partly in response to the change in context, both the government and the businesses are starting to look into it. So, for example, Gazprom working on the technologies on producing hydrogen by dividing natural gas into carbon and hydrogen. The hydrogen can be used for the power sector and carbon for chemical industry and so on. And they estimate that the current pipeline network can accommodate up to 20% of hydrogen, which can be added to the transport of natural gas. But more work and research needed there on this issue, and we also need to consider the existing contractual obligation for the supplies of the natural gas. Again, it all depends on the volumes of natural gas needed, which need to go through the pipeline network. And of course, hydrogen can also be transported in a liquefied form. In terms of Russian state, in October 2020, Russia signed the action plan on the development of the hydrogen sector. A lot of this plan is focusing on the domestic sector, but really it's looking forward in terms of the possibility of exporting it outside of Russia. Russia prioritizes so-called yellow and blue hydrogen, yellow produced from the nuclear power and the blue one from the natural gas. The plans for the green hydrogen from renewable energy is very briefly mentioned, but it's mainly due to the fact that there is very limited production of renewable energy in Russia at the moment, but in the long term, it's also been considered. So at the moment was a roadmap developed up to 2024. So to conclude, and not to take too much time on this, the evolving EU's priorities in energy sector, climate policy will of course have impact on Russia, and in the long term, it seems that along with the natural gas, Russia will focus on the development of the hydrogen sector and exploring the potential for exporting hydrogen to the European Union. So if there is anything not mentioned, I will be happy again to pick it up during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. And now, last but not least, we will be happy to hear about the case of Norway from Professor Ole Gunnar Austvik, Professor of Political Economy at the Norway University of Applied Science. So, Ole Gunnar, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marco, and thank you for having me. Obviously, Norway is a large natural gas exporter, but at the same time, we are supporting the efforts to cut the greenhouse gases according to the Paris Agreement. And the Norwegian government's approach to EU-based climate plans is actually more or less to work fully with them, to implement their plans in a cooperative and as realistic way as possible. It's a combined green and blue energy policy that is currently the status of Norwegian policy towards the climate change challenges. The outset for policy making is very much that although Norway is not a member of the European Union, we are having the European Economic Area Agreement, the EEA Agreement, which makes us an outside country, but still inside the EU rules and regulations. We have actually we are actually full participant in a single market, as EU member states are, except for two areas, which is agriculture and fisheries. So in terms of the single market, the only difference between Norway and the member state is that we don't have a say in the final decision making in the European Union. So energy is accordingly inside the EEA agreement with all its rules, regulations, taxonomy, and principles. And the challenge then is how to combine for Norway these two interests at the same time, the blue and green policy. If you take the green part, Norway is probably most known for its petroleum sector, but it also have a significant green part. First of all, we can say that the domestic electricity production is fully produced of renewables, hydropower first of all, and now also some wind power. It's not any use of coal, oil, or even natural gas in electricity production in Norway. More than 40% of Norwegian passenger cars are run on battery power now. And in climate policy, Norwegian policy is coordinated with EU climate policy. It participates in the emission trading system and on EU emission reduction policies in general. And often this market, these solutions in the European Union is very similar to what has been done in Norwegian and Nordic electricity markets already before the EU implemented it, liberalizing its electricity markets already in the 1990s. And also the combination of green and blue policies in the energy sector is emphasizing, for example, that the offshore technology is able to and will emphasize the development of large offshore wind projects supplying electricity to Norway and to Europe. The blue part of the policy, natural gas, as Olga mentioned, the long-term contracts has been developing the market for a few decades now. And it's a lot of sunk investments in producing countries in Norway and North Sea, downstream to the markets, but also in the markets in the receiving countries and for the companies involved. So this is a very integrated market over time with a lot of investments and interdependency across Europe. The single market for gas and electricity is not yet fully developed, but it's very integrated already compared to a decade or two ago. So if consumption of natural gas should be reduced or even abolished over some time, as part of the climate plans, it's a concern for Norway as for other exporters. But it's also a concern for downstream countries and companies. For some countries, it might threaten their security of supply. And if you see the Central Eastern Europe countries, it's not only dependent on Russian gas, but it's also dependent on gas as such with the infrastructure. And it would actually threaten their security of supply if they shall move, it should not be used when they move away from more polluting coal. So it will probably not be possible to phase out natural gas fast, maybe not in a very long time perspective, if security of supply also should be included in the considerations. Based on the dual perspective for Norway, the four issues are emphasized in current policies. One is what I mentioned already, that some gas must remain to be used in the energy European market. It must be used as a bridging fuel when you move away from more polluting sources like coal, first of all, as an intermittent or variable energy, renewable energy supply alternative, and as a source for hydrogen, of course. First of all, aiming for electrification of all end users is not likely to be an effective approach. And the cost of the continued use of this infrastructure will be help to avoid overinvestments in other electrification of the economies, which will be a loss if you not only consider the green solutions, the green goals, but also economic efficiency and security of supply. So it should be a common interest for Norway and the EU to balance in these different aspects of natural gas, both in the short and long term. And if uncertainty over investments to maintain natural gas production will increase, secure supplies from Norway, for instance, and others may decrease. And even if gas demand falls, you might even see higher prices on gas if supply is dropping faster. And volatility is the only benefit of speculators, not for consuming and producing countries. Obviously, when you shall aim for this stability, gas is a very natural source of supply as a bridging fuel in the transition process from the more polluting sources. The role as an intermittent is very important in a long-term and permanent perspective. Obviously, if it's no wind or no sun, it will be no electricity. So you need something to supplement the renewable energy source, the most relevant renewable energy sources, and natural gas is the medal winner in this as with a comprehensive infrastructure and the lowest emissions of the three fossil fuels. Upgrades of electricity grid to cover all kind of uses will also be very expensive. So probably natural gas will not be used only to produce electricity, but as a source of energy and uses in itself. Then finally, of course, hydrogen is an important part. Hydrogen produced from natural gas is today cheaper than it is produced from water, but it has the problem of emitting CO2, so you need a carbon capture and storage technology to be developed at the same time. And this is a very important focus in the Norwegian government plan, is that you want to work with the EU to develop this technology in a commercial available manner. And we're not yet there, but the Norwegian stand is very much that this is a common interest to manage, and even it is the hydrogen is produced at the end of the pipeline, which is the first thought in the EU or in, let's say, in Norway. It's a question of costs and more issues to be discussed, of course. But the main issue for Norway here is that we see this is a common challenge to solve, and hydrogen from natural gas is a very good alternative to get down in the markets if you can solve the carbon capture issue. So finally, we have been through a long period since the Second World War. We're building the societies on coal and oil and natural gas and the fossil fuels, and we're still there. No, more than 80% is still oil and gas and coal, which had wide political, geopolitical, economic, environmental consequences. And Norway is participating in this development very much to mitigate the security of supply problems from the Middle East and, let's say, Russia too, as considered, as a player with the EU, not least in natural gas. So obviously, when you should balance in the green interests, the environment and climate concerns into those considerations already in the EU, which has been very much concerned about an efficient single market in economic terms. We also have to add the security of supply, security of demand for those selling gas, like we are here now. So in all these balances, it has to be rebalanced, and the green element has to be stronger, but it shouldn't be a black-white picture in my view either. So that is the Norwegian approach. I think that the blue and green approach is actually a win-win situation. It's a realistic, more a realistic approach than to close down everything and to not to do anything. And it will take some time across energies, across sectors, across countries. But as a conclusion, as an outside country of the EU, but still inside, we think it's a clear possibility to find win-win solutions here, both in the short term and in the more long-lasting periods later on. So thank you for this introduction, so we can take the debate afterwards.
Thanks a lot. So we had very rich and interesting inputs for the discussion. I do have some questions myself, but I see that we already have some questions from the audience. So I'll try also to group them and direct them to the to the right speakers. So we have some questions about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. A participant is wondering whether such an instrument might incentivize regions outside the EU to adopt carbon pricing mechanism. I think this is a question that will be interesting to address to Mostafa and Olga. And then a question is whether a properly designed carbon border adjustment mechanism could, for instance, offering a market for green renewably produced hydrogen would be a positive incentive, would create incentives for Russia in particular to decarbonize its own economy and become less dependent on fossil fuel exports. Then we had a question about the Russian leaders, and this is probably also for Olga. And how would you characterize the attitude of the Russian elite towards climate change? And if I could integrate, to what extent the main barriers in Russia for catching up on decarbonization and renewables deployment are situated in the specifically in the elite and the political leadership of the country. So let's start. Let's start perhaps with the first two issues with Mostafa and Olga.
Okay, I can start. Regarding the CBAM carbon border adjustment mechanism, or as I said, simply carbon tax, first of all, you have to look at what are the drivers, or what are, the elements that are leading to these carbon taxes. What you see is about preventing what they call carbon leakages, to make sure that whoever is producing manufactured product or whatever in Europe, we don't find the situation where those producers will move to another region where you don't have the same kind of decarbonization constraint. And of course, the other main driver, and that's the overarching one, it's about, really implementing decarbonization and going working towards the carbon neutrality goal. And I'm sure Tudor can add to that, I'm sure. Now, with respect to its relevance, or could it be applied to a region like the MENA region, I think it's not it's very difficult because, you know, the drivers are not the same. The drivers CBAM in Europe would not be the same in a region like MENA and possibly some other region. There have been discussions about whether a carbon pricing mechanism should be introduced, and that was discussed, but I can tell you that it's not going to be tomorrow that you will see that kind of, you know, mechanism developed. So right now, neither CBAM or even carbon pricing could be envisaged for a region, a hydrocarbon exporting region like the MENA region. Having said that, as I said, the timeline is very important. Now we're talking about a target of carbon neutrality going to 2050. If you look at the different phases, let's take the one to 2030. If you look at 2030, countries like North African exporters could be in a situation where there will be a very reduced market for gas export to Europe. If the situation goes according to plan and we see this expected drop in gas demand in Europe, without even decarbonization measures, there won't be really a market for certain producers who are focused on Europe. So the concern about, you know, the European gas market was there before even the discussion about carbon tax or kind of measure came into place. So I think it's very important to look at the timeline. So between now and 2030, it's going to be a transition and everybody is going to try to adjust. No, we won't have CBAM or carbon pricing, similar mechanism applied in the MENA region because of the different drivers. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that the region is not concerned about, you know, climate change, is not concerned about, you know, carbon neutrality. This is very important, something that a lot of people forget, that one of the regions which is going to suffer the most for climate change is the MENA region. And it's happening again already. So we can see it. So yes, it is of concern, but it's a different kind of equation for that region compared to Europe. I'll say more, but I'll let Olga, you know, comment on the Russian case.
Thank you. Olga.
Okay, I want to try and group questions directed to me together, and to start actually with the question on the Russia's climate policy, and then come back to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, because these two are related in my opinion when it comes to Russia. Well, Russian attitude of the Russian state at the moment on the fight to climate change is very modest. Is the softest way I can put it. Russia did ratify the Paris Agreement in 2019, but the targets set there for Russia can achieve without changing anything, pretty much, because the industrial outputs of Russia never fully recovered since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the economic decline which followed led to a reduction in the CO2 emissions of Russia. And so the target levels which are set there can be achieved without changing anything. And a lot of kind of commentary around Russia's participation in the Paris conference and the Paris Agreement links it more with like PI and trying to re-establish its more kind of a positive presence internationally after the quite turbulent couple of years prior to that. So the climate strategy is very modest. The targets are very modest, maybe a bit more ambitious in terms of energy efficiency, but when we talk about renewable energy, and if we compare these figures to European Union or some other countries, it's practically non-existent. So if we not taking into account the large hydropower stations, when the share of renewable energy is still under 1%. And there are a lot of problems there in terms of integrating renewable energy into the national grid and so on, which all slows it down, because quite a lot of investment needed in the development of the sector, and a lot of work needed to be in terms of developing legislation on the federal level there. And as a result, it links to other questions which I received. So what would intensify Russia in decarbonizing its own economy? Would the carbon border adjustment mechanism be one of these incentives? It can be, I suppose, not to the extent of the whole economy, but the companies which are orientated towards export to the EU, they will have to take it into consideration, obviously, because depending how well the mechanism is designed, how solid it is, how many loopholes are there, it would create pressure for at least the sectors of the economy which are working with the EU, exporting to the EU, to integrate it somehow. And you can see it without the carbon border adjustment mechanism. You can see this international pressure on some companies, not only in the oil and gas sector, but other carbon heavy industries, how they trying to implement it and design their own strategies on reducing carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, and kind of creating some sort of provisions there. We probably cannot compare them like for like with some other states, but it is there and it's happening. So depending on how it's designed, how it's defined, it will put certain pressure on Russian business, of course. In terms of incentives for the green renewably produced hydrogen, it's something very long term, and for this to happen, much more should be done in terms of the renewable sector in general in Russia, and it's a very painful process. These questions got me very excited to talk about it, but I don't want to steal the time from the whole discussion. But it needs it's sort of like emerging industry in Russia, and the Russian state so far focused on trying to develop the technology, because technologically Russia is also need to do a lot of work in terms of renewable energy. So there was this kind of financial incentive to produce the renewable energy with the locally produced elements of the kind of like technology localization requirements. But again, we're talking about less than 1% of overall energy consumption coming from renewable energy, and it would need a lot more work in terms of integrating it to the grid. And without integrating to the grid, there would be no much incentive domestically in Russia to produce more. And it's a very long-term process. If both Russia and the European Union would work together on finding kind of like a mutually beneficial approach to this, then it's possible, but in a long term kind of like perspective, more short to medium term, it would be more the type of hydrogen which I mentioned previously. So the yellow and blue hydrogen is more likely than the green one. I think I covered the questions addressed to me.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. We also have another question on Norway, but before talking about that, since we have talked about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, I see there is a lot of questions and curiosity about that among supplier countries. So I would also give the opportunity to Tudor Constantinescu to expand his views on this subject.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying again to connect, including the camera. I don't know if it works. Does it work?
We still can't see you.
Yeah, let me see if I can do anything about this. Maybe now. Still doesn't work?
Nope.
Then I'm afraid I don't know what is the issue.
Okay, but we can hear you very well. So
as long as you can hear me, at least it's okay. Now, of course, thank you. It's of course a very interesting discussion with, of course, also many questions, and where I don't think anyone has now all the answers. Let's be very, very clear. And now speaking, I fully understand also the concerns, and which were very well explained by Mostafa, of different type of countries with different type of opportunities. So it's not an equal sign about all exporters are not having the same opportunities. So it needs clearly collaboration. It needs also to understand each other, and also to see how we can go into this journey together of building a carbon neutral economy. Let me say also, as I underlined in my presentation, also it is not just the EU. Now we saw Japan, we see China, we see Australia, we see more and more countries moving in this direction. Let me just speaking like this, a couple of years ago, the biggest importer of hydrogen was Japan from Australia, and it was just hydrogen from fossil fuels. Now Australia is shifting and is having a strategy to moving towards almost entirely renewable hydrogen and tapping the huge potential for renewable it has. So I think this can be something to reflect on also on many of the countries which have a big potential for renewables, being in North Africa, being also Russia. Now, of course, now there is a time for transition, and even in our strategies, in our analysis, how to say, in the climate plan impact assessment, we see towards 2030 a modest reduction, for example, of the use of natural gas. But one has to bear in mind that this, at the same time, there is a reduction of production of natural gas at EU level. There are countries like Netherlands who are moving away from natural gas production, a significant amount for the EU level. So the amount of imports may not be put so much at risk in terms of volumes towards 2030. I don't have exact figures, but there is a certain balancing here. Yeah, I think this is a period which offers also opportunities for working together and for trying to adjust to the things which are happening, to adjust also in terms of innovative solutions. And speaking about technologies, in Europe, for example, research and innovation, we were doing 10, 15 years ago still electrolyzers of 10 kilowatt. Well, 2-3 years ago, we started to build the first one of 10 megawatt, which is now in operation in Shell refinery in Köln to support, because the first big markets where hydrogen is used, and we try to decarbonize because 90-something% of the hydrogen it used are in fertilizers and refining industry. So in our strategy, we have a step approach. First, try to decarbonize the existing hydrogen users. These are big markets there. And now there is an interest from this refinery to build 100 megawatt electrolyzers. By the way, we also launch under research innovation now the call at European level for building 100 megawatt electrolyzers, and things are moving relatively fast on technologies. And we see that the things that are the cost of new hydrogen is too expensive. The IEA analysis, let's take independent analysis, shows that by 2025, 2030, renewable hydrogen may be less costly under certain conditions, of course, than blue hydrogen. It depends also on the region, and depends on if you are a price taker or an exporter. So it's of course varies the situation, but there is a big potential, and there is a potential to invest now and in the coming years in research, innovation, but also in large-scale demonstration, in applying technologies. And I think it's the only way to become also for every region of the world really to show the commitment to addressing the climate change, but also to modernize the economy, to modernize the industry, to build eventually the industry in some countries, to have an opportunity for industrialization in some countries, to have an opportunity for modernization in other countries. I think it's very much changing the angle and looking at this per ensemble, and to see both, of course, the changes, but also to see the opportunities which come, and with the fact that this can really bring to a more sustainable development, and also creating a number of jobs and opportunities in technologies and in sectors which will drive the economy and the innovation further. So this is, I think, in terms of this adjustment mechanism, carbon border adjustment mechanism, this is still under an exploratory phase. There are a lot of discussions. There is not yet a line which I can know or share with you at this stage. But of course, there are many dimensions to this. However, it's what I think is important is really to exploit the potential and not to underestimate how fast certain technologies can move, to have a good understanding of the fact that in the future energy system, as decarbonized as we want it, and in a carbon neutral economy, we'll need molecules, not only electrons, and to see how we can, in this respect, work together and tap the potentials, depending again on the potential, on the resources, but also the latent industrial potential which exists in many of the countries.
Thank you. We have then a question on Norway and again on Russia. So very briefly on Norway, whether continuing to bet on blue hydrogen or gas as a transitional fuels don't actually appear as increasingly short-term thinking. And the question on Russia, the question is why the integration of higher level of renewables into the grid is more of an issue in Russia than it is in other countries, given the very modest levels of production of renewable electricity compared to others. So I would let Ole Gunnar reply on Norway and Olga on Russia.
I apologize, I will have to leave relatively shortly, so just to let you know. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think that the Norwegian strategy is not only based on the bridging fuel and the hydrogen, it's also that natural gas will be used and should be used in the future, although it is not to the same extent as today, but as a permanent solution, both because of cost elements, security of supply elements, and as well as a variable energy source when you have no wind and no sun and no production of the green sources. So you actually you have to balance it in some way, not to exclude it. So I say it's the question is about the schizophrenia in Norway, because you do both. But I think multitasking is not an illness. It's a healthy way of doing some approach in in a transitional period. And in Norway, it's right that we are being very united supporting energy policy in Norway up to the last 10 years in hydropower, in oil and gas sector. Now it's more split domestically, where what I was referring to is the continued development of the oil and gas industry in combination with the changing taking place in the world and in the EU. While some in Norway, the greener part will say that it's a hypocrisy to produce oil and gas and to favor a green world. But I think it's not the right thing to. You can do both, and you should do both, and you have to do both in order to balance it in a better way. And we must be a greener world, a greener industry, greener economy. But it should be done in a proper way, where the most cost-effective results is developed, and it can be done together. So I think it's to multitask to manage these changes is actually the best way of approaching it, rather than to say that we should close down. Some in Norway said we should close down the oil and gas industry now because of we're supplying the world with dirty fuels, which I think is too extreme to be taken seriously. You have to balance and face in each of the different sources in the different sectors and energies. But this is obviously also a political issue to argue in international fora for Norwegian politicians and others to sell this argument that actually multitasking is a policy in transition, and we don't know all the answers yet, but it is the way to approach it. But maybe Norwegian policymakers should not have such a high profile on all the green parts. That I would say probably that it should probably more stress the combination of goals and issues than the green part only. That I would say. Thank you.
Thanks, Olga.
Okay, this is such a good question. Well, I'm going to try to answer as briefly as possible about why Russia struggles so much with increasing the share of renewable energy. Very briefly, it's because it needs the support from the state. So it should be intensified by the state, including financial support and financial incentive. Just a brief note about the pricing policy. So in Russia, energy is subsidized by the state. And major companies such as Gazprom, they make most of their revenue outside of Russia and have to subsidize energy domestically. It's been liberalized gradually in line with the requirements of the World Trade Organization, of course. But renewable energy in Russia is still more expensive than renewable energy in other parts of the world, where it's becoming cheaper as it was in the past. And part of the problem there, it's also infrastructure. There are different zones in Russia of how power is distributed. There's one zone which is connected to the central grid, and then kind of in between zone, which is connected not, and the third zone, which is outside of the central grid, which is a small isolated areas there. And for to increase the share of renewable energy in terms of the first zone, which is connected to the central grid, you need to create a kind of like changes to infrastructure, which would allow to do it, and to do it at a competitive price. And this is a problematic issue because the state, for better or for worse, in the support for renewable energy, they prioritized the issues of development of Russian technology. So the mechanisms for the promotion of renewable energy targets this element of a problem, the development of technology produced in Russia. So there is a tender system for the renewable energy installations from 2000. The decree was introduced in 2013, first tenders in 2013. Where companies can bid on new renewable energy installations, on production of new renewable energy, where they would receive support for 15 years, but the condition there is that they should meet the local content requirements. So at least part of this should be produced in Russia. And this share increases year on year for each different type of renewable energy. And the idea there that it would intensify the development of the sector domestically and the technology domestically. But it leaves outside of the scheme a lot of smaller companies which find it difficult to compete because it requires a lot of investment without kind of a more significant participation and the use of technology exported from outside Russia. So in 2017, renewable energy was actually one of the fastest growing energy sources, including in Russia, but it's still very small steps and much more needs to be done. And there are a lot of questions, even with the success stories of new installations in the remote areas which are not connected to the central grid, or what happens with them after they've been installed, what happens with maintenance and kind of like maintenance costs, and do they continue to operate and work years on, or is it sort of like a short-lived project which just not actually changes much. And this is only for wholesale market. So the retail market and micro generation, where people put their own small installations of wind turbine or solar panel, there is a completely different set of issues there. And it's also, in terms of legislation, very kind of like a merchant sector, because there is a question of price, how renewable energy is pricing against conventional energy, and can the people who install, let's say, a solar panel on their roof sell excess energy back to the grid, and how it is priced and how it goes there. So there are a lot of kind of like interconnected issues which prevent Russia from scaling it up, which is a shame, because every region in Russia has the potential to produce in renewable energy, different one depending on the geography and the climate. So it's very brief. I'm happy to continue this discussion because I find this topic very important, but I'm just trying to kind of not deter the discussion.
Thanks a lot. Did I understand correctly that Tudor would have to leave shortly?
Yeah, I saw questions there, and I can take it quickly because maybe it's relevant.
Okay. Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah, so it's I may make even another trial with the camera, but seems that something doesn't work. I don't know what. Now, of course, it's not. We don't put all the bets only on hydrogen. Let me be very, very clear on this. So first of all, and if you look at the long-term decarbonization strategy, but we'll see now also in the context, because now we have to move faster towards the 2030 objectives of 55% greenhouse gas emission reductions. What we think and what we had always put in our policy and energy strategies at EU level is energy efficiency first concept. So we first of all aim to moderate the energy demand. So the form of energy, the energy we don't use is actually maybe the cheapest energy and with the less environmental and climate impact. So both. and resources. So therefore, we look very much, first of all, at energy efficiency. And we may have even, if you want, an absolute reduction of the energy consumption, which is important, this decoupling of the GDP, which grows, and the energy consumption, which goes down. So this is the first thing. Then, as we move towards 2050, even if the overall energy demand is lowered, or the share of electricity is the final energy consumption will increase. So now it's only 23%. We move towards 50%. Okay, some scenarios, nobody has a perfect crystal ball or perfect modeling, but it's somewhere between 40 and 60, let's say on average about 50% the share, so more than double than what we have today as percentage of the final energy consumption. So first we reduce consumption in energy efficiency measures, then a good part of the final consumption will come from electricity and mainly renewable electricity. At the same time, we still have this other half we need to decarbonize. So we see, first of all, of course, we encourage very much the use of biomethane, biogas and biomethane in this order, and biomass, but of course with certain sustainability criteria, including for biomass, we need sustainability criteria. We don't want to damage the environment, not in Europe and not somewhere else. So next to this, of course, it remains still a very important part where we see a role for, in particular, renewable hydrogen, but also synthetic fuels. Can be synthetic methane based on renewable hydrogen and carbon capture by 2050, certainly from the air. Can be synthetic fuels, can be ammonia made in transportation, can be methanol as well, synthetic. So there are other options which are being developed where hydrogen will be an enabler, but for a part of the molecules. So it's really, we are aware that the solutions of the future will be much more complex, and the energy system of the future in the end, and this is perhaps one of the biggest challenges, to put together an energy system with 1,000 pieces is a puzzle of 1,000 pieces compared to the previous 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when it was a puzzle of maybe just 20 pieces to put together. So, and in this process, of course, digitalization will play a very important role in ICT to make this whole thing work, and to also have more distributed generation becoming cost effective, and consumers playing a more active role in the markets. I think this is the main direction, the way we see it, and how we try to integrate it to make it operational for Europe and not only.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a question myself for all the other three speakers. We have seen in recent years that for some exporters tried to pursue a strategy of diversification of their energy export outlets, looking perhaps a bit less of Europe and a bit more to Asian markets. But the question is now that also several Asian markets are now on the trajectory of climate or carbon neutrality in 2050, 2060. What are these diversification strategies still considered viable among exporters? So I don't know who wants to start, perhaps Mostafa and then Olga.
Yeah, it depends on the time. If you're talking about now to 2030, maybe a little bit beyond 2030, there could be alternative market. In fact, you know, countries, companies have been looking at alternatives. And of course, the Asia Pacific market is the one, is the big prize. Now, yes, clean energy policies are in place or being developed. Stricter policies are being developed in places like Japan, South Korea, possibly some other countries. But Asia Pacific, as you know, it's a huge area. And you still have coal dominating the energy scene. So the opportunity could be in this maybe evolving coal to gas switch that is catching up in terms of, you know, using cleaner sources of energy. But the competition for a share of the Asia Pacific market is ferocious. So unless you're kind of an established player like I'm talking about LNG, Qatar or Australia, it's going to be very difficult for countries like Algeria or smaller Egypt to compete in those markets. But it is an alternative market within a certain time framework. Africa is another market that gas exporters are looking at. They're looking at import of LNG, but also leveraging the indigenous natural gas resources that are being developed in Africa. So you could have, intra-regional trade, LNG mainly. That's a personal view. I should emphasize that. I don't believe in those giant cross-border gas pipeline schemes. Maybe at one stage they may happen, but not in the near future. So I'm talking about LNG trade when I talk about African trade. So you could find opportunities for alternative market in Africa. The challenge is it's not going to be the premium market that gas exporter used to have in Europe or even in Asia Pacific. So the expectation, the aspiration will have to change. But overall, globally, we're moving towards, a different energy mix. Yes, gas will still be part of the equation, but it's going to be a different kind of situation where decarbonization, where climate change consideration are going to be more and more important. And it's possible that countries which are now exporters may transform into just, consumers of their own indigenous resources. Some countries are what we call gas short. Their domestic demand for gas is increasing very rapidly, so they don't have or they won't have enough surplus gas to export, especially if they're not investing enough in the upstream. So the whole scene could change. But to go back to your questions, yes, there's still alternative markets in the Asia Pacific market, but boy, the competition is very, very tough over there.
Thanks. Olga?
Well, yes. Of course, Russia thinks about diversification of its energy supplies as well. And one of the markets for Russia, which Russia was hoping to expand into, is China. And it's been a kind of like a long process to start with because of negotiations about price and making sure that both sides are happy with the price, and there was some kind of a progress in this sense, and there's an increase in supplies to China. But again, there would be a limit of this expansion, also because of plans for achieving carbon neutrality. They are not just limited to Europe. They are developed in other parts, including countries of Asia Pacific region and in China. So it's also, there would be some limits on this diversification as well. And again, as with other region, there is a growing demand for natural gas domestically in Russia as well. So it's also one of the major consumers of natural gas. So there are some plans, and there is some work on this, both through the existing or expanding pipelines and liquefied natural gas. And it just also will need to kind of like adjust to the changing priorities of the consumers in that region as well.
Okay, thanks a lot. Unless Ole Gunnar, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, well, of course, Norway is the country with least alternatives in terms of natural gas. because of our position. The pipeline's built. Our LNG capacity is not so huge. We have an LNG plant in northern Norway, which was built and designed to supply the American market. But when it was finished, built, the shale gas revolution had taken place. So this gas coming from the one single energy plant in Norway is going to EU markets more or less entirely. And the pipelines are sunk cost to the UK or the EU. And the UK is the same climate plans as the EU, I think, is part of the Brexit agreement. So it is not a difference. So the diversification plan is actually, one is the interplay with the EU for all these uses that could remain. And it is the hydrogen part being produced in the continent or in Britain or in Norway and exported as such. To build more LNG capacity to serve the rest of the market is even less likely, as when you add all the arguments that Mustafa mentioned, to serve Asian markets, for instance, is quite unlikely from a cost perspective in Norway now. So more or less, EU remains now a monopolist for Norwegian gas, the single buyer as a group, which is, well, should be, is it legal according to single market regulations? Well, this is a dilemma, of course, and Norway is partly then stuck to interplay with the European Union too, just because of we are inside, not only in terms of real politics of the European Union, but also in terms of the market in natural gas. Oil is a bit different because it can be sold more or less globally to a much larger extent.
Thank you very much. I think we are really approaching the end of this discussion. I think we had a very interesting and rich inputs. We have been thinking a lot about that, and we will certainly try to continue to reflect on this particular aspect of the external dimension of the European energy transition. So I would like to thank you very much, all the speakers, for your comments and inputs. You really helped to make us understand better the state of the debate, even in our surrounding countries. So thank you very much, and we hope to see all the participants soon to further events here at the Brussels School of Governance. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.